Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And yes, I'm wearing my Michigan jersey because we won the national championship last night. Go Blue. But I'm absolutely thrilled to have back with me Teddy Jones. Teddy, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
We are going to talk about your latest book, Far From Uncertain, One Woman's Life of Crime and Other Righteous Deeds. Maybe we could start with what's the story behind the story that inspired you to write this book?
The previous book that I had done that related entirely in book to Borger, Texas, which was called Family of Good Women, ended with the two women deciding that it was important to do something that would benefit women who were being either abused or mistreated in other ways as a result of what was going on with the the change whenever martial law was declared in Borger that took care of a good deal of the lawlessness, and it also resulted in one woman who was mentioned ended up in a ditch, found with her barely alive newborn next to her. And that was what prompted the two in the previous book to decide that they were going to do what they could and they created what they called the Women's Benevolent Society with the help of other women there in Borger. And so I didn't really think much about it, to be perfectly honest, for quite a long time. I was also so relieved to have that other book finished. And then it occurred to me that I wondered what happened to that woman who was in the ditch. And so that set me thinking about her, and she became the person whose life is described by Margaret Kenyon as she's telling the story of Frankie. And so Frankie is the one whose life crime we're discussing in that title. And that's where it came from. And she's not a real historical person, but she certainly could have been, because there were a number of women who were either prostitutes people who were working dire straits because their husbands or significant other may have worked in the oil field and or been a participant in the illegal liquor trade and other illegal activities that were going on there. So that's where they came from. This book came from, was from wondering what happened to that woman in the ditch.
Could you remind our listeners who may either not be familiar with Borger, Texas in that time, or maybe even Borger, Texas today, just what a wild and woolly place it was?
Borger was not even an incorporated town until the man named Ace Borger believed that he saw the future when he saw they first discovered oil there in 1926. And so he quickly gathered people of like interest together, and they formed a group that began selling lots, because after all, you needed to serve the people who came there to tend to the oil field. And it was fast expanding, and it grew an amazing amount in a short period of time, as does any boomtown, whether it's oil or other sort of production. As far back as what we've had stories about gold rushes and all of that, there's always a boom, meaning it brings all kinds of people. And along with those kinds of people, there come people who tend to serve their more basic needs, such as food and shelter, but then also those who tend to the other concerns that people have, which are best described as vices of one sort or another. And so there's gambling, and there's liquor trade, and there's the prostitution, and all that goes along with that kind of wildness that overwhelms whatever law there might have been at the time when they arrived. It's just too much to deal with, because there are more people arriving in town than even ever thought that would be living there. And so that's what happened in Borger, and it's happened in there's stories about, not just in Texas, but in other places where was created by, let's just use oil as an example. It just throws the place into an uproar, and it's predictable because it's happened in so many places. And so that's what happened with Borger. And then by the time that was over, martial law had to be had declared by the governor of the state at the time. And they brought in not only the Texas Rangers, but also military, and they got things settled down in the trials. And it was I guess one of the main events that occurred that sort of sparked okay, this is enough, was that the local district attorney who had been attempting to make things better by dealing in whatever way they could with the police and local sheriff to deal with the lawlessness, and he was pursuing one after the other of the criminals they arrested. But the fact was that there were many in the police and sheriff's department who were bad with, if you want to use the term that you hear in the television about, in bed with the crime. And so they were making more money off the maintaining the disruption of civil status in town than they would have been making if they had been just doing their jobs. And so it was easy to make it corrupt in continuing fashion. And someone, and I don't know, I can't remember if I don't think they ever found who actually kill the district attorney in his front yard. And so that's when they declared martial law. And by 1929, which was when the previous book was set, things were calming down some. But 1929 was the big year when that occurred. It was like that was when we had to do something, or Borger was going to be a lost cause, and that's when the district attorney was killed and so forth, that the martial law was declared. So this character that is the topic of the story that is told in this novel began at the time that happened. That is the change in efforts to make the civil town again. She was, in fact, near death. And so by the time that followed, the next thing that happened was the Dust Bowl. And then we also had the Depression. And so it was just one bad thing after another happening in Borger. So not all boomtowns had suffered those several things in a row. It just so happened that these all happened in sequence in the following years. It was not an easy time for Borger, but they survived, and they have a town now that has a nice little museum that tells some of the history, and they have people who are proud of the town, and they have reason to be, because they've done a good job of staying in business, so to speak, and a good job of. They have a nearby community college, and they have just the normal things that small towns in Texas have. Plus, they have a Phillips petroleum plant there, and it's been going on for many years. And so that's a positive thing about the town. And that was it was interesting to me to have done that research about the town, and then to be able to go up and see it now and to talk with people who know some of these stories, not the stories that are fiction, but they know some of the background because they have had these stories told to them over the years. It's interesting. It's a good place to be. Someone asked me, a friend who lives in Minnesota asked, if we were going to travel there, what would we want to see? And I said, I don't know that it's not a place that you think of as a tourist attraction. It's more a place that is amazing in that it has done so well and survived as the kind of place that it is after having such a terrible tumult of its history early on. It's amazing to me, and I think that. And then I did learn that they do have some attractions in terms of places to eat and things to do. And I let her know, but I said, it's not like it's on Route 66. You'll have to get off the just to get off the usually traveled route.
So how were you able to accomplish a dual timeline to tell the story of Borger back then as the character grew, and Borger or today, and bringing those themes forward?
I thought it was important if I wanted this to have any relevance for today, because I thought thematically there were some things that were important still, that it needed to have something that connected it to contemporary times. And so that's what I thought I was doing whenever I had contemporary storyteller telling the story of a person who lived during those times, those earlier times. And it was only difficult in that I had to write down and make sure I wasn't mixing up who would have known what at what time and how you have to keep the story straight. So I wrote it basically as two parallel things and put them together. I had the core of Frankie's story in my mind, and I got that together, and okay, how are we going to have that told, and began to get that together and then put them together. So it took me quite a while to do this because I was trying to make sure to do what you said, which is basically not confuse the reader and to make it flow in such a way that perhaps people could see if they couldn't have seen it simply by telling the story about it happening in 1929 and 1930 and forward, that there's relevance to some of those themes in current times, just as there was then.
So I've always envisioned, whenever I think of a dual storyline, of the Crick and Watson double helix DNA. And because the two ends of the two major strands are parallel to each other, but they have little connections throughout. And that's always been a great visual for me, because when you tell a story like you did, I see both the parallel lines, but I also see how they connect, and they connect at more points that might be obvious at first. And you're able to pull that connection forward literally throughout time. That even be close to what you thought you were doing.
Yes, I hadn't thought of the double helix, but I had thought that it was important to make sure that the connections were there, but not be too obvious. I really don't like to try to slap people around, pointing to things and saying, "Did you notice?" And being subtle, it sometimes is lost on people. But it also, if you aren't, then it's too obvious, and it looks like you're evangelizing in some way. And that's not what it's fiction. I don't want it to be like that. And it was. I had to rewrite it a lot of times. It was rewritten more than once.
So how were you
Go ahead.
how were you able to bring such complexity to your characters? Do you sit and think about what they may have said, done, worn, or do you research it deeply so that you're so enmeshed in that time period? Is it all of the above, none of the above? How do
It,
you really get to that complexity of a character in fiction?
for me, it starts with finding a person that I'm going to think is worth writing a story about and that someone might want to read about and to develop. And so this person that I found in my mind was Frankie, as I mentioned before, and I saw her, and I say that in quotes, but I have to imagine for myself, and it means that I pace around a lot and think about how they would seem to me if I met them. And I had the advantage of having seen a lot of people in situations that were times of crisis for them in my earlier functions as a nurse. And it helps, I think, with your ability to observe and then to describe that you have that I have that background that says, I'm not just looking at things, I'm really making notes and looking at what are the implications of what I see, what I hear, what people are doing in proximity with one another, who stands back, who doesn't. And so those things are tools that I try to use as I think about the character. And I don't want to ever say this is what the character I don't want the characters to seem like someone I have described as a cardboard figure. I don't want them to be caricatures. And so they shouldn't be too good and they shouldn't be too bad, in the sense that if they're only one dimensional, then they are dull. They are not real. A villain who is all villain is just as unreal as saint is all saint. And so those things are in my mind as I try to create the character. And it's mainly what they say, what they do, how other people react to them. And and in my case, now a lot of other people accomplish the same purpose by writing very differently. I tend to prefer fewer words than more. You wouldn't think that by listening to me talk, would you? But I prefer to surprise readers once in a while rather than to immerse them in my style or writing. I think it's not, I want the writer to get out of the way. I want the story to be told by the people. And so for that reason, it takes a lot of writing and rewriting and paring down. I can put it all down and then it's way too much. And then I should go back. And I will tell you this, I also, every time I write, I was just working on something this morning that I'm begun, and I have written the same 6 pages in increments of 1 paragraph. And each day as I begin to rewrite it, I have changed it. And so that's the process, and it's a process of taking out, or it's a process of standing in the perspective of one or other or another of the characters that are in a scene and trying to sharpen rather than over overwriting to and underwrite at the point of making sure that I haven't called attention to who's telling this story. I want the characters to be carrying the story. So that's how my way of doing it. Other people do differently and do beautiful work. It's just that for me, that's the kind of story I want to tell.
How do you weave in the historical detail? And let me maybe preface it with when you were talking about Borger and the governor sending in the Rangers and the military. That was not the first time the governor had to do that with an oil town in the state of Texas. He had to do it in Spindletop. He had to do it in East Texas. He had to do it in West Texas. You mentioned, obviously, the Depression, the boom, but also the Dust Bowl. And I'm familiar with, obviously, that. And so I have all of these things in my head. Lucky enough to have grandparents who were born in the 19th century who could tell me some very old experiences they had. Does that all go into it, or do you do detailed research to bring the era, I can use that word, not ARROW, but era to life?
I had the advantage for this book that I had already done a good deal of background research that included Borger because that was where the other one was set. And in Texas, and maybe you didn't have that advantage, but
I did.
You did have grandparents like that. You said that were able to tell you stories. So did I. My mother grew up in Stinnett, which is up there in that same vicinity. Her father worked for a Humble Oil Company up there, and they lived in a oil camp. And she wasn't one to burden me with a great deal of stories, but if I asked, she would tell little tales about things. And then I saw other similar company camps where other relatives lived because they all worked for different ones in different places. And so I had some of that as personal background and stories that I had heard, but it was certainly beneficial to read things like The Worst Hard Time and to have read in detail about information from Borger. There were a couple of master's theses that people had written about whenever they were studying for a master's degree at one of the universities in the state about, but one of them was basically, it's saying Borger really got a bad reputation. It's not, there were a lot of good people there. And I thought that's really interesting. Somebody felt concerned about making sure that everybody knew there were some good people there too. Certainly and it was interesting to read that kind of thing. So yes, I did do a lot of that kind of research because I was interested in it as well. But then I had all that. Why not use it again? So that was another thing that made it easier probably to do this next story. And then there were the things in this particular book that just because I had the storyteller was a nurse, and so she had a history of some of the things that had gone on in nursing, and she was able to tell that as a way of demonstrating to the young reporter that there were connections between some of the things that she was trying to get him to understand about Frankie and with things that she had seen in terms of how people were needed assistance from others who were either more capable or more willing at a certain time in their lives to help them so that they were not preyed upon by people who were or left behind or those kinds of situations where people end up having lasting damage because maybe there were no one who was able to quote, rescue them for any particular period of time. That's why I think that it all comes together whenever you decide on the subject. That example is, yeah, I'm not sure I'm up to the one that I started writing. I was telling you, I was sitting here writing the same 6 paragraphs over, and I'm not sure I know enough about what I've chosen this one. And so it's each time I have to ask myself the question, do I have enough personal knowledge in terms of what would I want to know if I were the reader? What would I want to know if I were this character? And so I have to be careful what I bail off into. I admire people who can just write about anything. Yeah, that's great.
Why does Margaret want Frankie's story told?
Why does she want it told? She believes it's important people to understand that these kinds of problems still occur. People are preyed upon by people who are stronger than they are or who have not considered what they might be doing. Those kind of. She's lived long enough to say, I believe this needs to be told. And I've got you here trying to get my story, so I'm going to use this opportunity. And you're going to listen, or I'm not going to tell you my story. Because she had the perfect opportunity. It just came right into her lap. She'd been doing what she did for all those years. There it was. And yeah, maybe that's unrealistic, but it could happen.
Do you remember who Anita Hill was in the Clarence Thomas hearings?
Yes.
I cannot remember why, but for some reason, I watched those with my mother, and I watched Anita Hill's testimony. And at the end of it, my mother said to me, "That's it? That's all he did?" And she's crying about that. And I thought, we have really changed.
Mm.
And so I guess at that point, my mother was probably in her 60s. She was born in the 30s. And I'm not sure we have changed now that we move ahead to Epstein and everything that's come out since then. I'm not sure we have progressed very far.
And I think that using Margaret as an example, I think that she was demonstrating that some people could live through things and change at the same time. And I think that was a good use of that character to have her tell this story because it is relevant still.
So what can you tease us with what you're working on next, or is that still too much in development?
I'll tell you, the one that's coming out next is already in progress, and it will be out next spring. And it's a return to a place that I have worked for several times, the Jackson's Pond, Texas, an entirely fictional town. And most of the characters that have been the focal characters, there have been 4 before this one, and the focal character in each one of those was a female. And I thought, there's this man I liked him. I just liked him. And a lot of other people. He was in the last one, and I thought, I think I'll give him his story. He needs his own story. And so I may have failed miserably. We'll see. He's 68 years old, and he is the person who has enjoyed doing things that are good for that town for over the years he's been there. And he grew up there, and he enjoys doing things secretly that are good for people. He doesn't. And one of the things he did was make sure that when the cemetery needed to be enlarged, he has a realtor's license, among other things. Excuse me. And he made sure that they got a really good deal so that it would abut the current cemetery. So they could have just taken the town to the cleaners, but no, he made sure that didn't happen. And then he also likes to make a good business deal, and he wanted to be sure that there was still a funeral home in town. It's a small town. And so he's a silent partner. Nobody knows about it except the funeral director and the company he bought the interest in the funeral home. And nobody else knows about it. He had told anybody, and he managed to be a silent partner in this funeral home. And he just gives things that nobody knows who did it, even though it's a small town. And so there probably are people who do know, but he has a friend who's like somebody grew up with who does the I'm just a poor dirt farmer thing to the hilt. And it turns out that one day he wakes up on the ground next to his pickup, and he realizes that he thinks he's probably dying. And so that's how the thing opens. He doesn't understand what happened, but whatever it was, put him on the ground, and he believes he's in peril of dying. And so the story is going to be about what happens to him, and he has his moment of truth, if you will. Starts that I'm a human too, and I am vulnerable. And so he's an interesting guy. I'd like to meet him if I yeah. I get to make him Chick Tally is his name, and the name of the book is going to be Rise to the Occasion. You know the song that Nancy Griffith sang?
Right.
Rise to the Occasion. I like that song, and so that's the name of the
If you're going to start quoting Nancy Griffin, I'm going to fall in love with you even more than I already do love you. Unfortunately, Teddy, we're near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to find out any more information on you, connect with you on Instagram or Facebook, find out about your website. Could you tell us the locations they could go?
Yes, the website is TJONES Rights, WRITES.net. Excuse me. All you have to do on Facebook is put in Teddy Jones 148 and you'll get that. And Instagram, just my name. And that usually turns me up. I don't have a presence on any other social media because it makes me tired. And so I just don't.
Well, Teddy, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. I can't wait to get this book and then maybe the next one as well and continue this conversation.
Great. I enjoyed it too. Thank you so much for inviting me.